quick poll of the audience. I'm actually, after all of those ridiculously produced presentations, I'm just throwing mine away and I'm just going to talk. But quick poll of the audience really quickly. How many entrepreneurs or self-identified entrepreneurs, just show of hands real quick. How many people, okay, put them down. How many people who just work for a company in some capacity? Okay. How many people are, of those people who work for companies, how many people are possibly considering career transition or might want to branch out and do something on their own? If your boss is in the room, you can keep your hand down. Okay. Okay, cool. So there's a good blend, which is really interesting, and I think following from what Tim spoke about and what Lisa spoke about, I think there's some really interesting stuff going on. So going back a little bit, just for my own personal story, in the peak, or should I say the very beginning of the financial collapse, as we all remember a few years ago, about 4 weeks into it, when things were horrible and looked like they were only getting worse, I decided to quit my job. It was the only time in really my life that I had ever worked for anyone else. Throughout my early 20s and even in my teens, I was a serial entrepreneur. I was starting companies, some worked, some didn't, but I was learning along the way. And I sold the company when I was about 24 years old and moved up to Cambridge, Mass, and went to work for someone else, a very well-established company. And it was a very interesting experience, and I learned a lot. And I was there for about 2.5 years, and I was 26 and sort of, quote unquote, had it all, on paper. Great job. I was making more money than I ever thought I'd make, and I was still a kid. And I just decided during this massive collapse, when I had friends who were getting laid off, and people who were trying to figure out what to do next, people getting foreclosed on, et cetera, I just said, you know what, I'm going to quit. And immediately, of course, started getting phone calls from everyone I know screaming at me, yelling at me, saying, what are you doing, et cetera, et cetera. So the reason that I did this wasn't out of hatred for my job. It was a great company. It wasn't out of, thinking that knowing that there was something bigger out there for me. It was more that despite all the noise of the sort of financial collapse and everything that came with that, I knew about myself. And I think that's something that we often forget about when we get sort of caught working in sort of very structured institutions, groups, companies, nonprofits that have been around for extended periods of time. And part of that, my reason for leaving, was also that since this business had been around for quite a while, that it didn't really foster an entrepreneurial environment for its employees. So, and what I mean by that is not saying that, employees should be, working on side businesses until they can quit their job and leave when they hit it big, but more in the sense that these are companies, to Lisa's point before, where people work remotely, they are risk tolerant as opposed to being risk averse. There is no sort of chain of command in terms of management unless it comes down to something super important, so to speak. So basically, in terms of ideas in these sort of entrepreneurial structured environments, there is no ranking. An idea from a quote unquote receptionist or assistant is just as important as an idea from the founder or CEO. And I decided that in looking at what was going on around the world and especially in the U.S., that I wanted to go out and I wanted to interview a lot of some of whom were my friends at the time, a lot of folks who were succeeding rapidly and doing it at an incredibly young age. This is the first generation, really, and when I say this is sort of the millennial generation, quote unquote, people born sort of 1980 and after, if you will, who've had this unprecedented access to technology, education, information, et cetera, et cetera. So I went out and concocted this idea that I was going to go out and interview all these fascinating people and see what they were doing and see what I could learn from them and then see how that translated to paper, or perhaps maybe these people were just outliers and they were the exception to the rule. So in going around, a quick show of hands, is anyone familiar with the company Tom's Shoes in here? Every pair they sell, they give a pair away to a show. Okay, most of you guys. So basically, for those who don't know, Tom's is a company that for every pair of shoes they sell, they give a pair away to a child in need around the world. So in interviewing people like Blake McCoskey, the founder of Tom's, or like Ellen Gustafson, who was a co-founder of a charitable company called Feed Projects. I don't know if anyone knows Feed, but Ellen's speaking later here this week. In looking at folks like this and talking to them, what became more and more clear was that they were succeeding in areas, and you can define success however you want. It's not necessarily financial. It's not necessarily happiness. It can be a mix. It's unique to the individual. But what I sort of found was that they were succeeding, quote unquote, in fields where they really had no training in terms of conventional education, background, et cetera, et cetera. So Blake, for example, who had no background in shoe manufacturing. The reason that he's making these shoes and distributing them in the regions of the world where he's distributing them is to prevent a disease called panoconiosis, which is a horrible sort of foot fungal infection where creates elephantitis of the foot, and basically children aren't allowed to attend school, be it they don't own a pair of shoes. So if you own the simple pair of shoes, you're now allowed to attend school. So Blake he dropped out of college, during his freshman or sophomore year, and yet was succeeding in solving or helping to solve problems revolving around, health problems, or not problems, but succeeding in a shoe industry, knew nothing about. And looking at somebody like Ellen Gustafson from Feed, which distributed during the time that she was there 60 million free meals to children around the world through school feeding. The ways that they were going about it, and Ellen was a terrorism sort of policy wonk, before starting Feed. But the point is that these super successful folks were constantly learning outside of the classroom. And that's sort of where they got to where they are. So in looking at it from a sort of broad perspective, what we have right now, and it's been touched on before, and it's somewhat obvious perhaps, but I think it's very important just to remind ourselves of this. In the day and age that we live in, the access to and ability to self-educate that we have now is completely unprecedented and is growing at an exponential rate. The majority of the business owners, nonprofit leaders, even people who just work at companies that they happen to love for whatever reason, not necessarily founders, are sort of taking an approach to life in which they're able to educate themselves about things that they're interested in, and then find a way to incorporate that into their everyday life. In some cases, it turns into a business or a nonprofit. In some cases, it turns into sort of a side project. But whatever it is, it's something that sort of makes them happy. And that's where sort of the whole title of, it's not about finding a job, it's about creating a life came from. So for all these folks, they were able to create massive success for them, but also affect lots of other people in a very positive way. Sort of by taking this counterintuitive approach. So during the process of writing this book and interviewing about 24 of who I consider to be some of the most impressive people in the world in terms of what they've done, whether it's Tony Hsieh from Zappos or Elizabeth Gore from the United Nations Foundation, who Tim mentioned spoke earlier, is that they really, for lack of a better term, they just went out and did it. And they foster environments around them that enable others to take a little risk and not be afraid to speak up or suggest a new idea or present something that's a bit counterintuitive. Now, circling back to all of this, and sorry to cram in what would usually be a 60-minute speech into 12 minutes as I see the clock ticking here, but sort of in looking at the big picture of what's happened over the last 3 or 4 years, with trillions of dollars basically evaporated from the global marketplace, what hasn't evaporated and was actually increased is the amount of intellectual capital that we have, and the amount of, well, actually a lot of stuff, but largely the amount of intellectual capital that we have. And what's happening there is right now we're looking at 50% unemployment for recent college graduates who are probably, or many of whom are probably better sort of set up to succeed in environments that are more entrepreneurial based. So while we've had this massive drop in the finances and the resources in terms of cash, literally cash available to us, there's this brilliance and all these ideas and all this self-education going on, whether it's in someone's parents' basement or after work, reading about something that you're interested in or whatever it is. So as all of this is building up now, we have this massive pool of untapped resources, call it a distressed asset if you want, of people, individuals, some young, some not so young, who are sort of sitting there waiting for the opportunity to do something with it. So whether you're an entrepreneur or managing people or working at a company or whatever your case might be, sort of looking at the concept of how do we unlock some of this intellectual capital that's being stored up. We have these smart folks out there who are available and have great ideas, but the money isn't there. So it starts becoming sort of a creative way in mixing and matching, and to the point, so with my company, to the point that was made earlier by Lisa, sort of what we do is, we'll allow people to work remotely. It's getting innovative with the way that your company or your business actually is structured from a day-to-day basis. And that's sort of the thought that I'd like to leave you with in all of this. All the doom and gloom surrounding the economy and, jobs numbers and everything else, we hear that. There's a negativity bias in our brains where we're sort of attracted to that kind of stuff. And what we should really be looking at and thinking about, I think anyway, in terms of moving forward in the next 4, 8, 12 years and beyond, is how do we unlock that intellectual capital that currently exists? And how do we leverage it to, instead of being sort of defined as the lost generation, at least this generation of millennials, as the generation who found itself? So I'd like to leave you guys with that, and thank you very much.